If someone had told me a year ago that my life would take such an unexpected turn, I would have never believed them. Back then, everything felt so normal, predictable even. But life has a strange way of shifting when you least expect it, taking you places you never imagined you'd go. Peter had always just been my son's best friend. He'd been around our home for years, sharing meals, laughing with Jake, and treating me with the casual kindness of someone who felt like part of the family. To me, he was like a second son, polite, charming, and easygoing. But that night, something changed. Jake had gone out for the evening, leaving Peter and me alone in the house. It wasn't unusual. Peter often stayed over after their late night, gaming sessions or movie marathons. But this time, there was a shift in the air, an energy I couldn't quite put my finger on. I was in the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of wine when Peter walked in, stretching his arms above his head. His shirt lifted slightly, and without meaning to, my eyes lingered a moment longer than they should have. When I looked up, his gaze was already on me, steady, unreadable. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, nodding toward my glass. I hesitated, for a beat before offering him a drink. "Just one," I teased. "I wouldn't want to lead you astray." He chuckled, swirling the deep red liquid before taking a slow sip. "I think I'm past the point of being led astray," he said softly, his voice carrying a quiet confidence that made my stomach flutter. As we talked, about everything and nothing, I began to notice things I hadn't before. The way his eyes lingered when I spoke, the gentle warmth in his laughter, the way his voice softened when he said my name. And then there was my own heart, beating faster than it should, my breath catching at moments I couldn't explain. "You've really grown up," I found myself saying, tilting my head as I looked at him. Peter's lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. "Does that surprise you?" I met his gaze, and for the first time, I truly saw him. Not as my son's friend, not as the boy who had spent so many afternoons in our living room, but as a man. And in that moment, the air between us grew heavy with unspoken words. "I suppose it does," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. The silence stretched, charged, and fragile. I should have ended the conversation there. I should have walked away. But instead I asked the question that changed everything. "Do I make you nervous?" Peter's throat bobbed as he swallowed, his eyes darkening just slightly. "Not nervous," he said slowly. "Just surprised." "And does that mean I can't be admired?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. He didn't answer right away, and when he did, his words weren't necessary. The look in his eyes said everything. That night should have been a fluke, a passing moment of curiosity, nothing more. But I knew better. Something had shifted between us, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I felt it. In every stolen glance, every accidental touch, every quiet moment we found ourselves alone. And there we had been dancing around it for so long, and then one evening, everything changed. Jake had gone out again, leaving just Peter and me alone in the house. I was curled up on the couch in the living room, lost in the pages of a book, when he walked in. He hesitated at the doorway, and then slowly sat down beside me. "I can't stop thinking about you," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart raced, thudding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I turned to face him, and the intensity in his eyes stole my breath away. "Peter," I began, but he shook his head, cutting me off gently. "Don't tell me you don't feel it too," he said, his hand brushing softly against mine. "I see the way you look at me." I swallowed hard, my skin tingling where his fingers had touched. "This is dangerous," I whispered. "I know," he murmured, his fingers tracing the outline of my palm, sending shivers up my spine. "But I don't care." And then he leaned in. His lips met mine softly at first, as if waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. The warmth of his touch, the way he made me feel seen, wanted, cherished, it was too intoxicating to resist. I melted into him, my fingers tangling in his hair as the kiss deepened. His hands rested lightly on my waist, and there was no rush, no desperation, just something deep and undeniable blooming between us. When we finally broke apart, our foreheads rested together, our breaths mingling in the quiet. "This can't happen again," I whispered, but we both knew it was a lie. For weeks we lived in our secret world, stolen glances, whispered words in the dark, fleeting touches when no one was watching. He made me laugh again, made me feel alive, in a way I hadn't in years, but secrets like ours never stay hidden for long. One afternoon, as Peter's arm slipped around my waist in the kitchen, the voice I feared most shattered the fragile peace. "Mom?" I froze. Peter stepped back immediately, but it was too late. Jake stood in the doorway, his face twisted with shock, then disgust, then pure, unfiltered rage. "Tell me I'm not seeing this," he spat. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. How could I explain the unexplainable? "You're sleeping with my best friend?" he shouted, his voice cracking. Tears burned my eyes, but before I could speak, he was gone. And just like that, everything fell apart. Jake refused to speak to me. My husband found out. The divorce papers arrived within a week. And Peter, at first, he stayed. He held me, whispered that he didn't regret a thing. But over time, I saw the change in him, the hesitation, the guilt, the realization that he had his whole life ahead of him, and I wasn't part of it. One night, as we lay in bed, he sighed. "Luna, I think I need to go." I closed my eyes, forcing back tears. I had always known this moment would come. "I know," I whispered. The next morning, he was gone. But for the first time in a long time, I was okay with that. Because even though my world had crumbled, I had found myself in the wreckage. And if I could go back and do it all over again, I would, because for one brief, beautiful moment, I had known what it meant to be truly alive. Was no going back.